Perfect. And I'm going to kick it over to you, ladies.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. I often very much forget to hit record as well, so I can appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Kate Bailey with EcoCycle, the other Kate on the team. And so Rachel and I are just going to walk through some elements about extended producer responsibility. EPR is what you're going to hear us say a lot. And really big, exciting policy change, hopefully coming soon in Colorado. So we're going to talk through what's happening around the country, and then specifically what we're looking to do here within the state and how you can get involved. So with that, I'm going to hopefully share my screen there. Thumbs up. Okay. Awesome. So let's just jump right into what we are going to talk about today. I wanted to first just step back quickly and talk about the work that Rachel and I do as EcoCycle. So you all are very familiar with the Green Star Business Program and hopefully familiar with a lot of the other great initiatives we have at EcoCycle, one of which is our Policy and Research Department, which is mostly Rachel and I, and some other stuff that will in and out as well. But we really work at three levels. We work locally within Boulder County to help cities in the county adopt best practices around policies and programs. So we do a lot of work looking around the country at what are the best models and then helping bring those changes to Boulder County. We recently helped Boulder County update its Zero Waste Action Plan to help guide municipalities in how we move forward toward those zero waste goals over the next few years. We also work quite a bit at the state level. We are the authors of the State of Recycling and Composting Report in Colorado, which will be coming out with its fifth annual report coming out soon. That report covers how are we doing as a state, and we're not doing well. It's the spoiler alert. We have a 16% state recycling rate, which I think many of you know. So we also work quite a bit at the state level to help develop and advance policies to improve access to recycling, to attract businesses to the state, to use our recycled materials, to provide more funding for recycling programs and things of that nature. And of course, part of that was the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, which passed last year, which is going to ban plastic bags and styrofoam containers at the state level. So that kind of work is what we help build at the state level. And then at the national level, EcoCycle is a founding member of the Alliance of Mission-Based Recyclers. So we work with other nonprofits to champion federal policy around recycling and also to influence our industry. We work with a lot of stakeholder and brand engagement conversations, such as the US Plastics Pact. And so really fun opportunity for us to be talking about recycling at the local, state, and the national level. And there really is huge momentum around recycling at all three levels right now. So it's a very exciting time, and happy to take questions later about some of that other work as well. And then just a quick bit about myself. I have been at EcoCycle for 18 years as of last week, which is pretty crazy to me. I started out at CU Boulder. I graduated in a degree in environmental studies and economics and was fortunate to get hired at EcoCycle while I was still in college. It's just been a great fit ever since. I've had the opportunity to travel around the world and around the country to speak about recycling. This picture is me speaking at a conference in Brazil a couple of years ago. And when I'm not geeking out about recycling, I'm usually geeking out about hiking, gardening, or soccer. So also happy to chat about any of those on the side. And with that, I'll kick it over to Rachel.
Thanks, Kate, and welcome to everyone who's joining us. Thanks for logging in. I'm the Senior Policy and Research Associate. I've actually been here as of this week 2 years. And before that, I've been in the nonprofit sector doing a variety of work for about 20 years, mostly in Colorado. And most recently, I was at UCD doing a graduate certificate in environmental policy and law, and that's how I came to EcoCycle, was doing an internship with Kate on that, and has been a good match ever since. So when I'm not doing that, I'm hanging out with my kids and my dog, my husband, and reading or camping or enjoying the mountains. And my pronouns are she, her. So just to give a little overview, extended producer responsibility is a huge topic. We could do a whole semester course on it, but we are not going to. We're going to hopefully give you some solid overview on the main points of EPR, particularly when it comes to EPR for packaging. And we hope by the end of the presentation, you'll have an understanding of how EPR could improve recycling in Colorado, examples of where EPR is already working around the world, and excitement for what EPR can or could do here in our state and how you can get yourself involved both as an individual and as a Green Star business. So as we think about recycling, it's critical that we remember why we recycle to begin with. And often when we're talking about recycling, we frame it as a way to reduce what's going into the landfills, which it is, but it's really a lot more than that also. First and foremost, recycling is about responsibly managing our resources and addressing climate change. Using recycled materials is a proven way to reduce energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. It's also the most cost-effective strategy that we have to fight climate change. It helps reduce air and water pollution, which protects our environment and our public health. It's also about environmental justice. We know that reducing the materials that we extract, process, and throw away relieves the disproportionate burden our current consumptive behaviors have on low-income and communities of color. And finally, recycling is about building resilient local economies, which as Green Star businesses, I'm sure y'all are very interested in. Recycling materials instead of landfilling them keeps those materials in local economies as feedstock for manufacturing. This reduces dependency on outside markets and makes local manufacturers more resilient. We know that recycling creates 9 times more jobs than landfilling per ton. We also know that Colorado throws away more than $160 million in valuable resources each year that could be kept in local economies as feedstock. So our vision for Colorado is really that all residents have convenient, effective, and financially sustainable recycling services. We envision a thriving ecosystem of local businesses to recycle, reuse, and remanufacture discarded materials into new products, driving a circular economy, resilient local communities, and green jobs. In other words, we are all about resiliency, green job growth, Colorado manufacturing, and a circular economy.
Do you want to just add on to that? Well, first, we hope you support this vision as well. I think that's why you're on that webinar. And really for today, we're going to focus on how EPR is the next step forward in this vision and helping us realize these goals.
So quick background. Kate, I might have to punt more of these over to you. I'm starting to lose my voice again. Sorry, I had a cold last week. So what is extended producer responsibility? In brief, EPR is a mandated type of product stewardship through which producers take fiscal and sometimes operational responsibility for the end-of-life management of their products and packages. Product stewardship is a broader term that also includes voluntary programs for companies to take more responsibility for their products and packaging. But in today's webinar, we're really going to drill into extended producer responsibility, which is really more of a policy concept since there are tons of variations of EPR around the world. But in short, EPR policies require producers to fund the recycling of their products and packaging.
So the point we really want to drive home, and we're going to come back to this slide again a little bit later and explain this in more depth, but that EPR is really about funding recycling access. So when we talk about our vision for Colorado, where all Coloradans have convenient access to recycling, EPR for packaging is a funding tool to make that happen. It moves the cost of recycling away from local governments and ratepayers, and it puts producers in charge of paying for the recycling system. And we'll talk a lot more about what that means and how it works. But in a nutshell, EPR is really a funding strategy for recycling, can help fund all these different aspects of recycling, from collection to processing, education, and infrastructure. And so we'll revisit how all of that happens moving forward.
So before we get too far into EPR, we wanted to just touch on some complementary policy initiatives and acknowledge that EPR is not the be-all, end-all solution to recycling and circular economy. There are a lot of policies that go hand in hand with EPR. But what we do believe is that right now, for the situation we're in right now with our 16% recycling rate, with lack of access to recycling in a lot of Colorado, EPR is a huge, huge step forward. But looking at this list, it's also exciting to think about that there's work being done in Colorado at local and state levels that touch on a lot of these other policies, such as minimum recycled content requirements and market development center. That's hopefully legislation we're going to see in the coming legislative session. There's stimulus funding from COVID stimulus that will hopefully be helping to increase our infrastructure. We have a statewide organics management plan that, excuse me, CDPHE is working with organizations, again, like EcoCycle, to bring more composting infrastructure to the state, and a lot of other exciting stuff, like Kate mentioned, the plastics bill that passed just this last session. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on.
And I do also want to emphasize mention the federal policy. So I've been working in recycling for nearly 20 years. We right now have about 10 bills at the federal level that are related to recycling. I'm not sure I've seen 10 bills in total over the 20 years I've been in this field. So there really is unprecedented momentum to improve recycling at both the state and the national level. So these conversations are very timely, very ripe. Tons of big change on the horizon. So very excited to share that with you all and to get your help implementing these moving forward. So with that, we're really going to focus on two categories of extended producer responsibility. One is hard to recycle materials or toxic products. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking about packaging. But I want to just touch on hard to recycle materials because there's a lot of great work that's already been done here, and it'll help build out our understanding of how EPR can be effective and how it can work. So looking around the US, we have over 120 policies on producer responsibility for hard to recycle materials. So those include materials such as electronics, batteries, carpet, mattresses. These materials are challenging to recycle. They can be toxic, they can be bulky, they're just challenging to manage for one way or the other. And so there's a great history of nearly 2 decades of work in trying to build out programs to help recycle these materials better, to build out financially sustainable collection and processing for these materials. And you can see 33 states, 14 categories of products. It's a pretty robust ecosystem that's built out. And we are very proud that Colorado is one of those states that has already an EPR program in place. So I want to bring it home to how EPR is actually working on the ground in Colorado. And our EPR program is for paint. And EcoCycle was part of passing this legislation. The program went into place in 2015. And the reason we started focusing on paint was because it's a very expensive program to collect household hazardous waste. So I think many of you probably are familiar with household hazardous waste programs. They collect things like paint, motor oil, pesticides, all those things you're like, gunky, I don't want to throw that away or put it down the drain. But these programs were funded exclusively by taxes at either the local or the county level. And what we found were programs were extremely spotty. So Boulder County had a great program. We talked to places in Southeast Colorado that had no program at all. And there was no option for people to take these materials somewhere. It was also set up in a reverse incentive. The more you collected, the more it cost, which was more of a burden on local government. And paint, it turns out, is the largest component of household hazardous waste. And so there was a movement to try to get some of the paint program funded. So in 2015, looking backwards, not forwards, we were able to get a program implemented. I believe we were the 7th state at the time to adopt EPR for paint. And the way it works is that if you've been to Sherwin-Williams or Home Depot, you are now paying 75 cents on every gallon of paint that you buy. So if you look at your receipt, there'll be a little extra charge on there. That money is collected and distributed to cities and counties to pay for the paint collection. So essentially you are paying for the paint collection at the point of sale rather than at the point of disposal or through your tax dollars. The money is collected and the whole program is run by a nonprofit called Paint Care, which is a consortium of all the paint manufacturers. Again, Sherwin-Williams, Behr, all those companies have gotten together. They were charged with getting together in the state policy to run this program. They collect the fees, they pay the cities for collection, they contract for their own services. They've just launched a door-to-door collection program in most of the Metro Denver area. So this is really a program where the producers are in charge of paying for and operating this system, and it's no longer a burden on local government. And the benefits that we've seen is we're seeing cities and counties saving over $100,000 a year in some cases. 95% of Colorado residents now have access to paint recycling within 15 miles. And we recycled 4 million gallons of paint since 2015. So we've been able to scale up a much more effective program, a much more equitable program, while saving local governments money, while not spending any additional tax dollars, and creating a financially sustainable program for paint collection. So far, that has been a great success story for Colorado in extended producer responsibility, and we're hoping to build upon that success in looking at packaging. So let's segue into how do these program elements, how does that success translate into what we can do for packaging? And I want to start off by just saying that this is not new. EPR for packaging is in place in over 40 countries and provinces around the world already. In some places, it has been in place since the early 90s. So we have nearly 30 years of experience in which we're drawing upon in building out an EPR program. You'll see that the US is a big gray spot on this, but we're happy to share that now 2 states have adopted EPR policies. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. But in many cases, it's the same companies that are operating. Many global companies are operating under producer responsibility programs in other areas. And so there's a lot of lessons learned. There's a lot of great data out there to help us move this forward. So huge year for EPR this in the US right now. This has been a long time coming. It's a big celebration happening to now have 2 states that this past, within this last 6 weeks actually, have adopted EPR for packaging bills. Maine was the first, followed very closely by Oregon. So it's fantastic to have our first foothold here in the US. And that's not, it's not the end at all. There were a number of states that had legislation this year that are pushing forward in revised legislation for next year: California, New York, Washington, among many others. And there's also EPR legislation in the National Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. So we are seeing huge interest in EPR across a lot of state governments and at the national level. So this really is a very hot conversation right now. And this is not just something that's getting support from government. So very recently, over 100 global businesses issued a statement through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that they support EPR for packaging as the only proven and effective tool to provide sufficient, ongoing, and dedicated funding to increase recycling. This was a huge step forward in the business community in recognizing that EPR is a needed tool to improve recycling. This included really big names, Pepsi, Coke, Walmart, Unilever, Nestle, along with many NGOs, and really was a huge step forward. There's been a lot of pushback on the business community around EPR for packaging in the US, and I think this was we're seeing a sea change where there's recognition that this is a needed tool, that recycling is a very important foundation of a circular economy, and we need to invest more in recycling, and we need EPR to help us do that. And of course, also want to focus on the reason we're calling out EPR as a successful tool is because that's what we're seeing in other places. So we have a 16% recycling rate in Colorado. British Columbia has a very strong EPR program. They have a 78% recycling rate. So the data just really speaks for itself there. British Columbia, 98% of residents have access to recycling, and they've been able to attract $500 million of investment very recently into recycling. So they are definitely a standout in the world. Our neighbor just really to the north, essentially. So we know EPR can work well. We know it can be effective at increasing recycling, and that's what we're trying to do here in Colorado. And I want to talk also, so when we talk about EPR, we also get a question around bottle deposit programs. And so these are programs you're hopefully familiar with, but when you buy a bottle, a can, you often pay 5 or 10 cents at the point of purchase, and then you get that as a deposit, and you can have that refunded when you bring the bottle back for recycling. So a bottle bill, I think it most often called the bottle bill. Bottle bills are in place in 10 US states. This is really the original form of extended producer responsibility. And but the challenge is it is really only focused on beverage containers. And so I just want to emphasize that bottle bills are compatible with EPR for packaging. EPR for packaging takes a much broader swath of packaging, but we're not talking about one or the other necessarily. They're often very complementary, parallel policies. So if you are someone in the space of selling or providing beverage containers, we can definitely talk more about how these two policies interplay. But I just wanted to point out it's not an either or. They're not opposing. They're very complementary policies. So just to highlight a couple of things about Maine, was the first state to move forward. And so Maine is essentially a great model EPR program in that the producers are covering 100% of the net cost of recycling. So once the recycling group collects the materials, we're able to sell the cardboard, the aluminum, things like that for revenue. Whatever those net costs are to collect and process is now getting covered by the producers. This is expected to save cities and municipalities $16 million a year. So it's quite an impact on local governments. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the details around the materials that are included and how the program is set up. And then Oregon followed very quickly with the second program around the state. You can see at the bottom kind of some of the selling points on Oregon, really making it easy and convenient, equitable for everyone to have recycling, making it environmentally sound, and also just making it so that the producers are responsible from designing the product to what happens to it at the end. Responsibility really being the key word here. So one unique thing about Oregon that I will say is that it's not a full EPR program. It's just a partial program. The producers are not covering the full cost. They're only going to pay about 1/3 of the cost. But one plus for Oregon that would be likely here in Colorado is a uniform list of materials recycled statewide. So everywhere around the state, it's going to be the same thing that's recycled. And that's something we could definitely use here in Colorado. It would simplify the recycling process, it would improve education, and all that. So with that, Rachel's going to take back over, provided her voice is hanging in there, let me know, and walk us through a little bit more. We jumped right into kind of what some of the policies were, but let's back up a little bit and talk more about what's a producer, what's packaging, what's really involved in all this stuff.
Thanks, Kate. So sometimes people use the word manufacturer instead of producer, which is actually a little limiting in the scope of what we're talking about here. So in short, a producer in terms of an EPR is a company that makes, licenses, or imports packaging for sales, use, or distribution in a jurisdiction, in our case, in the state. In most cases, you can think of this as a consumer goods company. So if you think of a box of cereal, when you go into the cereal aisle, you pick up your box, General Mills or Kellogg are the producer, not the company that makes the box and the vacuum bag inside. Likewise, we're not talking about the grocery store you're in, not the Kroger or the Safeway, unless you're buying a store brand, in which case they are both the retailer, but they are also the producer. And so a lot of the EPR policies, actually, most of them that we talked about earlier that have been introduced in the US have some sort of clause that protects smaller companies. Often it's based on either the weight of the products that they have put onto the market in the past year, there's a minimum threshold there, or the revenue that the company has had in the previous year. And those are similar from bill to bill, but they do range. So that's something in Colorado we would have to figure out what those thresholds are. So also we need to define packaging and paper products. That's an important thing if we're talking about EPR for paper and packaging. Again, those are things that vary from policy to policy, but there is an overall theme. Packaging material is generally considered material that is used to protect, contain, or market items. So if you think of cans, bottles, bags, even sometimes the tags that are attached to an item to describe what's in it. Paper can include any sort of paper made from any fiber for any use, brochures, magazines, boxes, any paper product. Producers pay for these materials whether they are currently recyclable or not. They pay by the amount of the material that they have put onto the market, and we'll talk more about the fees in a couple slides. The couple things that are interesting to note that in the US policies that have been put forward, they are almost entirely focused on residential recycling, so consumer-facing packaging. Some of the policies have included recycling programs that are in public locations or certain types of businesses like schools, where the recycling system is probably very similar to the residential recycling. It's also interesting to note that some of the policies have included serviceware, so plates and cups. Not all of them do, but some of them have. So again, some definitions that we'll want to pay attention to with a Colorado bill and get feedback on. So in a nutshell, some of these policies are 60, 70 pages long. So in a nutshell, this is kind of how an EPR policy works. The government, in our case, it would be the state legislature, sets the requirements for the companies to fund recycling. They set the criteria such as certain percentages of population have to have curbside recycling, other smaller municipalities maybe need to have some sort of access to a drop-off center, those types of criteria. The second step is that an independent nonprofit producer responsibility organization bids and then is selected to be the PRO, producer responsibility organization, the PRO for the state managing the program. In the case of paint, I think Kate mentioned Paint Care. That is the PRO for paint stewardship in Colorado and a number of other states. So in our state, we would have a PRO that oversees packaging and paper products. That PRO, they come up with the fees for the different types of materials. So for your aluminum, your glass, your cardboard, they are also going to create the plan to say, this is how we are going to meet the goals that the state has set. And then they're going to implement that plan. And the third step, the plan actually has to go back up to the government oversight body. Here in Colorado, that oversight body would be the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. They have the final say on whether or not the PRO's plan is accepted and can move forward. So once that's approved, then the producers will be paying money into the PRO based on the amount of packaging that they've put on the market. And then the PRO will go ahead and implement that plan, working with local municipalities and service providers to educate the population to process, collect, transport all of those recycling materials. And then finally, there's an annual review reporting process where the PRO is going to report back to CDPHE and say, this is our progress, this is what we've done, here are some recommendations we have for how to change the program in the future. And there's that sort of dialogue also. The one step we don't have on this slide, I think we're talking about more later, is that usually there is some sort of advisory committee, and it's often housed in Colorado. It would most likely be housed under CDPHE, and that advisory committee would have representation probably from municipalities and counties, from waste haulers, from recyclers, from producers. So you've got a variety of people providing input that can help the PRO make sure that they're connecting with both municipalities and the producers themselves. So the big benefit of EPR really is the funding structure, the sustainable funding for recycling. Currently, if you were looking at this slide, it would be that the consumers are paying not only the brand owners by purchasing their products, but the consumers are also paying either their municipality or a private hauler to come and take the recycling. Once you have an EPR, the consumer is buying their product. They're going and buying that box of cereal. Kellogg's or whoever is then paying into the PRO. The PRO is doing all the payments to the municipality and the processor to make sure that there's recycling for the consumer. So it really streamlines the process and makes sure that it's more equitable. It's important to note also with EPR for packaging that unlike the EPR for paint care, where you're paying a designated amount in addition to your gallon of paint, 75 cents on top, the prices are internalized for packaging. So in other words, I'm going to buy my box of cereal and I don't realize that I'm paying another penny or a fraction of a penny for my box of cereal. I don't see that cost. It's internalized and it just moves down through the process. And studies have actually shown that consumers are not adversely affected. That's one of the bigger pieces of opposition that folks have for EPR, that this is going to just cost more money for packaging. And when we look at it, there's actually, I believe it's a fraction of a penny per packaging item. So it's not a huge adverse impact on consumers.
So Rachel talked a little bit about the PRO, the Producer Responsibility Organization, and this was really the heart of how EPR for packaging works. So the state legislation will require that companies need to be part of a PRO or have some type of recycling service in order to sell products in the state. And so what happens is companies get together and form this producer responsibility organization to collectively manage their responsibility under the regulation. So the example we have right now is Paint Care, which is all the paint companies managing our paint program in Colorado. And then there's also different PROs or product producer responsibility organizations around the world that are in charge of managing these packaging programs. So in British Columbia, it's called Recycle BC. In Quebec, they have another one. So they tend to be regional. We would expect either a state or national group to form to manage our packaging responsibility. And that group is really in charge of developing and implementing the plan to meet these recycling targets. So let's say our legislation says we want 60% of packaging to be recycled by 2030. The producer responsibility organization would conduct a needs assessment. They'd look at what's that going to take to reach that target, and then they'd lay out how much infrastructure we're going to need, where we need better collection programs. From there, they're then able to determine, okay, how much money do we need in the system? So then how much do we need to collect on the different types of packaging? So the PRO is the one to collect the fees. The fees do not flow through the local government. It's not collected by the retailer. It's paid by the brand owners. The PRO is also not directly a service provider. They contract with service providers, either municipalities or haulers, to have those materials collected. It's not that we're asking Coke or Walmart or somebody to start running recycling trucks. We're just trying to help them fund the program. The PRO is also in charge of self-policing itself to make sure that all of the packaging companies are participating in the system. We want this to be a level playing field so that all businesses are paying the same, are having to participate in the program to make it both fair and the most effective. And that's a responsibility on the PRO. And then of course, reporting to the state and updating the state on how it's going, the challenges, things of that nature. So So I want to talk a little bit about the actual fee structure and what this actually looks like on the ground. So first thing is the fee is on all types of consumer facing packaging. So it's not on business to business. We're just talking about consumer facing. So like the cereal box, the beer bottle, the 6-pack holder, that type of thing. The fee is on all packaging regardless of whether or not it's recyclable. Even though the funding goes toward making the recycling system work, if you make a package that is not recyclable or maybe it's compostable, you still pay into the program. And the fees vary depending on the type of material and the type of packaging. So for example, different types of, so the fees maybe look something like an aluminum can is going to have a set fee. And then a PET plastic bottle is going to have a set fee, but then a PET tray or another type of non-bottle PET. So there's a lot of classifications on pricing. There are internalized costs, as Rachel mentioned, there's not a line item on the receipt for what is the price on the product. And then another big component of this, which I'll give an example of in a second, is financial incentives to design better packaging that can be more widely recycled. The technical term for this is eco-modulation, but basically it's either a financial incentive or in some cases a disruptor fee to say, you know, your product is not recyclable, it's a contaminant in the recycling process, so you're going to pay more, or your product is very widely recyclable and non-toxic and you're going to pay less. So this is where EPR programs really help to drive green design and help better align our packaging design with our recycling programs. And so I want to give an example of what that fee structure looks like. So this is the Quebec program, and they have about 30 different types of materials that are broken out for their fees. But this is just a couple of examples. So you can see the fee on an aluminum can it would cost 8 cents per pound of packaging you put on the market. Aluminum is very recyclable. It also has a pretty high revenue when we sell it for recycling. So those costs are pretty low. You can see a PET bottle is going to come in at 12 cents per pound. It's a little bit more costly to manage plastics in the recycling system. Plastic films are definitely more challenging to manage than bottles. So they're going to come in at 22 cents a pound. And then something like a polystyrene food container, like the foam takeout boxes, those are really difficult to recycle. So they're going to come in at 36 cents a pound. So that's an example of how you, as a producer, you're going to be able to look at this and say, oh, maybe I could switch to PET instead of polystyrene and help reduce my costs and have a more recyclable product. There are also then these additions. So that's the base pricing, again, based on the weight of the packaging used, not per unit, but just total weight per year. There can then be some additional factors as eco-modulation. So for example, if you use 50% recycled content in your PET or your polypropylene plastics, your cost drops 50%. So that's a big incentive for you to add more recycled content. If you have labeling on your package that instructs consumers how to recycle, you can also get a cost discount. So again, promoting good education. But then you can have disruptor fee. For example, if you use black plastic, which is very difficult to sort for recycling, you actually pay a 10% increase. So you can see that these additional fees are meant to incentivize packaging design that's most compatible with recycling, that's most sustainable. There's a great number of examples of this, but it's really helped aligning the packaging design and the financial incentives with the recycling system. So let's this all home, right? EPR is a really big concept. This can be really complex legislation. Let's bring it down to what does this mean on the ground for you as a Colorado business? So the first thing to know is, are you going to be considered a brand owner? So the definition we have below is, are you the legal owner of a brand for a product sold or distributed in the state? If that's you, then you are going to be a member of the producer responsibility organization. If you don't sell products or packaging, that's not you, and you're not going to be registering with this program. So the first thing is to know, are you a brand owner or not? And of course, there will be a ton of outreach and definitions, and a lot more is going to go into this type of policy. I should say that states have multiple years to implement these types of policies. So this is not, we're going to move forward with legislation. It's going to be many years before it actually gets up and rolling. So don't worry just yet about whether or not, if you're unsure if you fall into this category, but just kind of wanted to play out the scenario here. So if you are a brand owner, if you are selling beer and you're putting out, bottles or cans and 6-pack holders, you're going to need to register with the producer responsibility organization. You're going to need to report the amount of packaging you sell every year by both the type and the weight. So pounds of glass used and pounds of paperboard 6-pack holders, things like that. And then you'll be assessed fees based on that amount of packaging and the type of packaging that will help fund the recycling system. As Rachel mentioned, there are exemptions. These are pretty common around the country and around the world, that small businesses are exempted. Definition varies a little bit, and this is definitely somewhere where we could use your help. Some states exempt producers under 1 million in sales. I've seen that as high as 10 million in sales. And then it's also determined based on the amount of product you distribute, somewhere between 1 or 5 tons of product per year. So this is something that, we're actively shaping this legislation right now. We very much value your input on this and many other parts of this. So a lot of this can be customized to what does our business community look like here in Colorado. There are also standard exemptions for packaging that has to be made a certain way to meet federal requirements. So pharmaceuticals, over-the-counter drugs are a great example of things that are exempted from this. These are another thing that we could really use input here in Colorado. Should we be considering cannabis packaging? Are there other industries, sectors, types of packaging that should have these types of exemptions? So love to talk more about those kinds of things. We want to focus on that. We really hope that EPR for packaging will be a benefit to Colorado businesses. So for all of you who have employees anywhere in the state, your employees will have convenient access to recycling at their home, their apartment. That is really not the case right now. We know, especially in most of the Denver metro area, that most residents have to pay extra for recycling. They have to go out of their way to subscribe to it. 60% of multifamily apartments do not have any on-site recycling. So first and foremost, we're going to see really widespread access to recycling for all employees. So if you're a business that has sustainability at top of mind and your employees can't recycle at home, there's a big disconnect right there. So EPR is really going to help ensure everyone has convenient access to recycling. The policy is really designed to be a level playing field, so it's not any unfair competitive advantage. Everybody pays into the program, but there really are good incentives in place to reward companies that use less packaging and that use more recyclable, less toxic, more sustainable packaging. So I know a lot of you are on the cutting edge of reducing waste, choosing the right materials for your packaging, and you are rewarded under this type of system. And then lastly, this is going to create a really consistent supply of recycled materials for you to use in your new packaging. So if you're looking to add more recycled content, you can't always get those materials. EPR is really going to help with that by providing just a greater amount of recycled materials for businesses to use. And so we really would love to hear your thoughts on particularly a number of aspects of the policy, but just the policy in general, how this lands, what you see as the opportunities and the challenges. In particular, a couple areas where we really could use some input from sustainable and or smaller businesses is on a couple of the definitions. I mentioned, what do we want to use as a threshold for small businesses? How do we consider the definition of a producer? What is packaging? Those are some very particular details that vary a little bit around the world, and we want to get it right for Colorado. There's also an opportunity to make sure small businesses are represented both within the producer responsibility organization and any type of advisory council. So being able to write into the legislation that either of these groups must contain at least one small business representative or something of that nature could definitely use some help on that. We're also very interested in how we get feedback on this policy from the business community. So we would love to hear where this presentation, what kind of spaces we should be talking about this in. What are the key trade groups or other groups that, that we want to reach out to be a part of that. And along with that, what are the unique needs of Colorado businesses? Are there other state statutes that are affecting you? Are there different market conditions? We're building off the success of Maine and Oregon, but we are not either of those states in many ways. And so we're looking for something that we can customize, that's the right fit for Colorado, that can evolve with us over time. And of course, anything we missed, we haven't thought of any concerns that come to mind. It was definitely very interested in hoping to engage a lot on business input. So this is what our timeline looks like. So last year, CDPHE was tasked with writing a study on what does EPR for packaging potentially look like in Colorado and making some recommendations. Those recommendations just came out this past July, so hot off the press. And we have begun as a key member of Recycle Colorado, some stakeholder outreach around extended producer responsibility. So small group discussions just like this, kind of establishing the foundation of what is EPR, what could this look like, what are some concerns, what are the opportunities. So really critical to have your engagement in the next few months as we shape what this policy looks like. And then really hoping to have your support come next year when this policy is hopefully introduced in Colorado to help advance it through the legislature. So just in a nutshell, that's where we are in the process. We are engaging really heavily with Recycle Colorado. We're doing some specific sector-based outreach. So we're talking to municipalities, talking to businesses, talking to waste haulers about the different impacts on the different spaces and players. We would love your input on other business groups to do outreach with between now and the end of the year. We'd also love your input on how to shape the draft bill. And again, your support testifying, sharing legislative alerts with your team, any ways you can think of to help engage moving this policy forward in Colorado. And I just want to end with underscoring that this is complex policy, that this is something that has a lot of key elements to it around definitions, structure, standards, reporting. So there's a lot of opportunity for engagement, and would welcome input on a lot of this process. And then I just want to end the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about extended producer responsibility for packaging? Why is this the right step forward for Colorado right now? And this really comes down to the wealth of benefits that we as a state will have from an EPR program. First and foremost, it's going to significantly increase our recycling rate, which is going to be a huge step forward in reducing climate pollution, in reducing air and water pollution. So huge environmental benefits from bumping up from our current 16% recycling rate. EPR is probably the biggest step forward we can take to improve that recycling rate. And in part because it provides recycling access to all residents. We really have really spotty access, especially if you live in an apartment or a condo. So this is really about making access convenient and also equitable across the state, and doing it in a way that is not, we're not requiring households to subscribe to recycling service or to pay extra for recycling service. This is about making sure that the costs of recycling are embedded in the cost of the product and not something extra you have to pay down the line. We are hoping to make a program in which we can have a clear list of what is recyclable statewide. So really make it less confusing with a strong education program to again make recycling more effective. And then really looking at how we can use those recycled materials here in Colorado to bolster local economies and create new businesses that are using those recycled products. So with that, huge thanks from Rachel and me for listening in and sharing your thoughts in the discussion as well. And so Kate, I will turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Super insightful. Sorry about any noise that my dog is about to cause. He pushed his way in. So we did have some questions that came up. One of them was, is there a reason the definition of packaging is excluding business to business? Can it include business to business with customer facing, or is that too much for the first legislation?
That's a great question. In an ideal world, I think it would include all packaging, but what we're hearing is a lot of pushback that there is business to business. The pushback is that there's already a pretty strong market for more industrial, more business type recycling. So think about the grocery stores, for example, or larger manufacturing facilities that are already recycling their cardboard, their shrink wrap. We're not necessarily looking to fund that program. We're really looking to fund residential recycling where there really is a gap. So that's, and I would also say that there's just the complexity of this. This is a big change. This is a complex program. And so what we've seen around the world is let's start first with residential and then let's start to expand out of that. We are seeing some countries moving toward also funding commercial recycling, more business to business packaging. We are seeing growing interest in expanding this to funding composting, right? We haven't even talked about composting infrastructure on here as well. So there is a little bit of a mindset of like, start a little smaller and then expand out, which is basically driving that. Rachel mentioned that there are really several layers of packaging that are covered under this. So, you know, some of that transport packaging, so you get into the primary, the secondary, and the transport packaging. So some of that gets a little closer to business, you know, when you start talking about pallet wrap and those kinds of things. But so far it's looking like we'll probably keep it focused on residential just to start smaller and build off what other folks have done so far.
And the transport wrap, when you're talking about e-commerce, that would be included. So if you're talking about the, you know, the box that comes from Amazon that has your cereal box inside of it, at that point, then that transport box is included.
I'm glad you said that about compost, because I have on my notes in very large bold letters, food waste ? Is that would be something really cool to explore, is how the packaging affects food waste down the line and how to build in some form of incentive for supporting compost and things like that.
Yeah, and that is actually something we're hoping to do in the Colorado legislation that has really not been done before. Compostable products will have to pay into the system just like any other type of packaging. But we're hoping to do is specifically earmark that funding goes into funding compost facilities that are able to accept and compost the compostable packaging. So really help build out that composting infrastructure here in Colorado.
And with the eco-modulated prices, there is some language in some of the bills that also rewards design for reusability. So, you know, take back programs or other types of reusability can also be worked into this. So definitely we're interested in looking at that as well.
Very cool. So another question we have here, also from Garrett. Everybody else, put your questions in the box, even if you don't think they apply to you. Some of your friends aren't on this conference call, so speak up for them. Is there a plan for producers that make hard to recycle items like plastic film that are not parts of packaging?
So we talked a little bit about hard to recycle materials at the beginning, and then we sort of focused over on packaging. In the ideal world, we would have a lot of EPR programs focused on both hard to recycle materials and on packaging. We tend to talk about packaging as its own thing because it is really a giant universe of a lot of different products. There is still a lot of work to be done on producer responsibility for film plastics, for mattresses, pharmaceuticals. There's a whole lot of stuff that we would still like to do as a state. We feel like packaging right now, there's huge momentum, there's huge impact, that this is the right conversation for Colorado right now. But certainly some of those conversations about the other hard to recycle materials are really needed and are happening in other states and a little bit here as well. So that's a great point about, you know, plastic film in particular is very hard to manage.
I wanted to add a couple things. You know, I mentioned that there are other policies that are complementary to EPR, some of those being bans of particular materials. You just had 1162 that banned single-use plastic bags, but some of these EPRs, either by themselves or in conjunction with other policies, ban particular material types, polystyrene potentially, that's just really problematic. And another piece of this that can, again, either be part of the EPR or complementary is end market development. A number of the state policies that have been put out require that the PRO use some portion of the fees they collect to help develop end markets for the materials that they are collecting. Partly that's just good business. They're collecting them, they got to do something with them, but that is sometimes legislated that the PRO has to be investing in those end markets, along with investing in the actual infrastructure for collecting the materials. So building both of those out.
I had a question that seemed, as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, how would you even do that? So apologies if this just is one of those questions. Has anybody approached EPR from like a paying for damage that has already been done from their packaging? So looking at recovering materials from landfill?
Not that I've seen so far. Some of the, like EPR for paint is a good example of where it does help fund paint that was produced, 30 years ago, that's still sitting in your basement going, ugh. The legacy paint is what they call it, legacy products, abandoned products. But similar to what you bring up, there are some states that are pushing that EPR should also cover litter cleanup. That it shouldn't just be funding recycling, but that also a good part of packaging ends up littered in the environment, and that is a burden on local communities that is causing a lot of damage. And what we're seeing is that there's a push to have that included as well. And that's going to start probably with, again, a needs assessment, because certainly packaging is not only the only source of litter. So it's really, we have to start by establishing, how much of litter is packaging and what would be a fair, cost impact on that. So that's the closest I've seen in terms of like direct damage to the environment.
There is, and this goes back to the PRO being charged with making sure that all the producers are participating in the program, but along with the legacy, there are also references to orphan products. So, something sneaks in from a producer that's not participating, that's still on the PRO. So it's in their best interest to get those producers participating in the program and paying into it.
Great, thank you for that. That makes more sense now. We seem to have a pretty quiet group right now, unfortunately. I know we're going to end up getting a lot more questions once folks get the recording and go back through that. I know the folks from Westminster, a lot of those businesses were not able to come on. That right there's 25 businesses alone. So I will be sending a massive follow-up email to you, Kate and Rachel, with all of their questions. I think you've given us a lot to think about with regard to specifically how can we contribute with the definitions. And I know there's some pretty significant industries that we have represented in the Green Star Business Network, like cannabis and the brewing industry, that will all have feelings on these things. Even just thinking about the idea of the exemptions for prescriptions. And is that medical cannabis only, or can we look at recreational and how that all applies? I'm really excited about that conversation. That conversation, whether it will be with you lovely gals or not, we will be following up on EPR at our next GSB meeting. So we're going to be talking about, I feel like I shouldn't be telling you this because you might skip out, but I want to give you fair warning that I will be expecting heavy participation in this next meeting about how we can support EPR measures going forward in Colorado, and how each one of the businesses in the Green Star Business Network can help communicate with their industry and help support this. That's the main point of GSB, is showing that you're the leader in your industry with regard to sustainability and zero waste. So now, I haven't really pushed you in the past, but now it's time to put your money where your mouth is and get out there, start moving and shaking.
Hey, can I just say, again, please, if you have questions, whether it's directly related to you or just kind of wondering, please email me, email Kate, send them over, because as we move through this, this is a huge, huge policy piece that we're putting through. And all those questions, somebody else has that question too. So the more we can hear those questions and help answer them, and just be aware that folks are wondering those things, that's going to be super helpful in how we talk about this, how we help craft the policy itself. So please, please, please do share your questions and your ideas if you've got other ideas too. Thanks.
Let me just say, this is an opinionated group, so you will have that come through. They might be a little quiet right now, but you're gonna get some opinions and questions and feelings coming your way. So did either of you want to say anything before I go through with announcements and just a few general housekeeping things for GSBs? No? Awesome. So I'm gonna hop right into those announcements. So our next meeting was supposed to be September 15th at 10:30, but there is a little scheduling snafu going on with that. So I'm looking at September 14th or 16th at 10:30. I'll be sending out maybe a doodle poll or just connecting with y'all individually to figure out which time works best. We might even separate it into two groups, since, like I said, I am going to be calling on people, and we're going to be talking through some of the bigger issues that Kate and Rachel have put out there today. For follow-up, is it okay if I send out the PowerPoint as well as the recording? Yeah, perfect. With that, I'll send out a bunch of questions for y'all to mull over, so you won't be caught completely unaware, since that you have plenty of time to strategize how you'll answer these questions before next month. Also, EcoCycle's 45th anniversary is this year. It's kind of a big deal. So the party is going to be at 5:30 at Boulder JCC, and I actually don't have the date on here. I think it's September 9th. I'm going to send out an invite. You probably already got one. I'm going to send another one, so y'all have no excuses to not be there. There's going to be beer from Avery and good food and good company, so please make sure to come. And then also, if you folks are interested in getting out and kind of being around people again, we have some really cool volunteer opportunities. We need some zero waste goalies in Longmont for the Green Star events. That's August 27th. And then also the Louisville Fair is going to be August 20th and September 3rd. So if you guys are interested in volunteering, in my follow-up email, I'll have a link for you to go on and sign up. Please also send that link out to your employees if you have a volunteer, certain volunteer hours that get paid for each of your employees. That would be a great opportunity for them. And then really exciting, EcoCycle and the business department have been working really hard on launching a polybag collection program along Pearl Street. And that is finally happening this year in time for Fashion Week. So September 8th, we are going to be launching a polybag collection pilot along the Pearl Street Walking Mall. So 8 businesses-ish will be signing up and having their plastic bags collected every week by high school students from Boulder High School who are going to be paid to run that collection. They'll be taking a bike with a trailer, collecting all of the bags, dropping it off at a panel truck that will then go to EcoCycle's Charm, where then it is collected by trucks and turned into composite lumber. Really, really exciting program. It's a first of its kind program. So once we show proof of concept, just like everything else, we are going to try and spread that far and wide so other businesses can start taking advantage of that type of a collection. So more to come on that. And as far as announcements goes, that's it. If anybody has another announcement that they really quickly want to throw in the chat, let us know. We're going to wrap it up now. So the follow-up email should go out today or tomorrow. It'll have the PowerPoint, it'll have the recording or a link to the recording, as well as links to everything I just mentioned in the announcements and questions for the next GSB meeting. So with that, Rachel, Kate, thank you guys so much. You're incredible. This was super enlightening. Keep kicking butt and letting us know how that goes.
Thanks for having us, and thanks for your support in the future.
Yeah, awesome. Sweet. I will talk to everybody later. Thanks for a great webinar.